Okay, good morning. We're going to call this meeting of the TRPA Operations and Governance Committee to order. The date is Wednesday, December 13th, 2023, and it is 8:33. Maria, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Aguilar. Ms. Dis.
Here.
Ms. Gustafson.
Here.
Ms. Hill. Ms. Hill, I can see you. You're muted.
I'm here. I apologize.
Mr. Honigman. Ms. Lane.
I'm here.
Okay, Madam Chair, we have a quorum.
Great. I'll go over some of the remote and in-person meeting rules for the day. For the members of the public who are joining us remotely, go to trpa.gov. Under the calendar header, click on Governing Board Hybrid Meeting for December 13th, 2023. There you will find a link to the public webinar hosted on Zoom. To address committee members directly with your comments, raise your hand in Zoom by clicking Raise Hand at the bottom of your screen at the appropriate agenda item. With your hand raised, you will be unmuted by TRPA staff and have 3 minutes to address the committee. If you have used the dial-in numbers to join us by telephone, you can dial *9 to raise your hand and be unmuted. For items that are agendized as information only, we will hear public comment during the general public comment period at the end of the meeting. Comments on items agendized for action or possible action, we will hear public comment before the committee takes action. To remote committee members, if you wish to speak, you can also now raise your hand in Zoom. You will find the hand icon on the bottom of your screen. Remote committee members may not use the chat box to make any comments or to have sidebar conversations. Please, everyone, remember to mute your mic unless speaking to cut down on the background noise, and likewise, unmute yourself so we can hear you when it's your time to speak. Finally, I would also like to ask that all remote members turn on their cameras if they are able. Members of the public who have joined us in person, please raise your hand at the appropriate time for public comment, and you will be called on to the front to speak. Committee members who are in person, please raise your hand if you wish to comment and speak clearly into the microphone in front of you. If you're viewing the webinar on a personal computer, please ensure that your microphone and speakers are turned off to prevent radio feedback into the room. Next, we'll go to approval of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda?
The only change to the agenda is we'd like to swap the order of the monthly financials and the audit to do the audit first. I think that's numbers 4 and 5. Other
Okay.
than that, the
All right.
agenda is fine.
Without objection, we'll do that. Any other changes? Good morning, Mr. Honigman. Try to squeeze in quietly, not gonna happen. Okay, can I have a motion, please, to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Thank you, Ms. Gustafson. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. We'll now go on to agenda item number 2, which is approval of the minutes. I've already miserably failed as chair as I read the minutes and could not find any errors, but I did try. Are there any changes to the minutes from November 15th of 2023 that are listed on page 9 of your packet? Seeing no changes, any changes online, Ms. Hill or Ms. Dis? Seeing none, may I have a
No.
motion?
Oh, I just said no. I'm sorry. This is Jessica.
Nope, I appreciate that. Thank you. Motion to approve the minutes of November 15th.
So moved.
Thank you. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any
Aye.
opposed? No opposed? Okay, thank you. We'll move on to item number 3. Oh, which is the dreaded election of the chair and vice chair.
Acting Chair, I have a proposed motion.
Ms.
If you'd
Gustafson.
entertain, I'd like to move that you remain as our chair and esteemed leader here. And that if Ms. Dis is willing to be the vice chair,
Thank you, Ms. Gustafson.
would you accept that nomination?
Maybe. You know, when you take the oath and it says, any mental reservation or,
Yeah,
you're kind of
with
like, I would be happy to, and I would be especially happy to if Ms. Dis would be willing to serve as the vice chair.
Yes, I would be happy to. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you. There's a motion on the floor. Is there any further discussion? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Any opposed? Okay, motion carries. We'll go ahead and go on to item number 5, which we're swapping out to get the audit started.
Yeah.
Mr.
and,
Kyler?
since I was going to do a short introduction, but I guess it's going to be a little lengthy one. I do want to give credit to my staff on this. This is one area where I wind up picking all the credit, but they do all the work. It turns out most of the work on the audit happens at the same time as our annual budget. So we divided things up, and I do the budget, and Kathy Salisbury, our controller, takes the lead on the audit. And this is all a reflection on her work and the work of her wonderful staff. Casey Davey is also there. She's our senior accountant. She and Kathy wind up bearing the brunt of all the requests for information from the auditors, but they get a great deal of assistance also from our grant managers, Caroline Stutzman and Mirjana Gavrik. And unfortunately, Georgina Balkwell is also another one of our grant managers that wasn't able to be with us here today. So this is, getting a good audit isn't just about answering all the questions when they come in. To me, getting a good audit means that you're doing the right thing every day. You got a good process in place, you're following your processes, you're paying attention to the rules, and you're doing that well. So this audit outcome is a testimony to all their fine work and dedication. Just to say a little bit of work about our outside auditors, we've always had an independent outside financial audit. Davis Farr has been our auditor for some time now, going back to a predecessor firm that they spun out of. I think they've been our auditor since 2010. I personally come from private industry where changing auditors is a red flag. Other people think you should change auditors every so often, but to me, there's a steep learning curve there, things like that. But anyway, there are auditors now. Mark has been a partner for us for most of this time. As you might tell from his last name, he's a name partner and the managing partner of the firm. And I'm going to turn this presentation over to you with one final statement, and that is that the auditors work for you, not for Julie and I. So this is for your benefit, and by all means, make sure you're satisfied with what he has to say to you today. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, thank you. We got a slide deck for you today to walk through the results of the audit. Next slide. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about what the scope of the audit was. We'll talk about what management's responsibilities are related to an external audit, what our responsibilities are as your auditors, and then some high-level information related to the results of the audit. Next slide. So this year, the scope of the engagement was identical to the way it's been the last several years. We conducted a financial audit of TRPA as a whole. We performed a single audit of your federal financial expenditures for this past year. We conducted TDA audits, 2 of them for El Dorado County, one with the local transportation fund and one with the state transit assistance fund. A TDA audit for Placer County related to their local transportation fund. A financial statement audit of the Tahoe Science Advisory Council, and then a compliance report related to your expenditures related to Proposition 1B. Next slide. So management's responsibilities related to the audit is they are responsible for preparing the statements and including the notes to the financial statements. And sometimes they will ask us to assist them, which they have done this year. And in prior years. And in doing so, before we can issue the financial statements, we do ask them to read over the preparation of the statements, make sure all the numbers tie out to their books, and assume responsibility for those statements, even though we use their numbers to be able to prepare those statements. They're responsible for preparing the financial statements in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. And as Chris alluded to, designing a system of internal control that's over financial reporting that's going to ensure that the numbers you're seeing, there's a good sound system for how those are getting reported and tracked and recorded throughout the year. And then also that the financial statements are free from material misstatement, whether that's due to fraud or error. And just to touch on that for a second, from a fraud perspective, this is not a fraud audit. We don't come in and we're looking for fraud. We're not looking for fraud. However, we do need to assess risk associated with fraud. And we send out a number of questionnaires throughout the organization, both to financial management and other employees in the organization, asking about whether they're aware of any fraud or suspected fraud. And if we get responses back, we are obligated really to follow up on those responses to ensure that there's nothing there that is going to that could lead to fraud or that may change our audit approach. So we take all that into consideration designing our audit procedures. Next slide. So our responsibility then is to express an opinion on your financial statements, and we conduct our audit in accordance with two sets of standards: generally accepted auditing standards and also government auditing standards. And that requires us to plan and perform the audit to obtain reasonable but not absolute assurance that those statements are free from material misstatement. And what that means is we will conduct this risk assessment that we had talked about. We will design tests based upon the facts and circumstances surrounding the given year, and do enough work to be able to express our opinion. We don't obtain absolute assurance. That would involve looking at every single transaction that's incurred by TRPA and saying that it is okay, and that just becomes absolutely cost prohibitive. And so we do everything on a test basis. So the procedures that we do perform are based on our judgment, and the procedures that we perform vary from agency to agency. Again, focusing on the facts and circumstances surrounding your agency, we'll design procedures to address issues here. Next slide. So from a timing perspective, we did send out a letter during the course of our final portion of the examination, November, to the board, just letting you know what the timing was, that the audit was ongoing, and if you all were aware of any instances of fraud or suspected fraud, to communicate back with us, and we didn't hear anything from that. But we did conduct the audit this year in two phases. We were here in June. We were remote in June of this year doing our interim procedures. That really involves our internal control work and testing of transactions and compliance with existing policies and procedures here at TRPA. And then we began the final portion of the audit in October, and that continued through last week when we issued the final financial statements last week. So draft reports we did give to TRPA in November. They went through and reviewed, provided feedback on those, finally gave the okay, and we issued final reports, like I said, last week. The most important thing in all of this that we've talked about so far is you did get a clean opinion. That's an unmodified opinion, and that's really what you want to see. Next slide. This slide here just shows year-over-year changes of the numbers on the balance sheet and income statement, really at the 30,000-foot level. And all of the graphs from 2023 to 22, with the exception of the expenses, are all kind of where you want to see. Assets were up, liabilities were up, but less than what assets were. Assets were up about 900,000 year over year. Liabilities were up about 739,000 year over year. That resulted in your net position being up 165,000 year over year. Revenues were up 2.2 million. Expenses were up 2.3 million. So although expenses were up more than revenues year over year, you're still in a good position from a net position standpoint. So everything looked good. Details of what the changes are between all the various accounts and everything are included in the financial statements in the management discussion and analysis section that management prepares. Next slide. So going and looking at the results of the audit, talking about the TDA audits first. On the two El Dorado County Local Transportation Fund and State Transit Assistance Fund, everything was good there. We did have one finding in both reports, and it's I'm going to call it a ticky-tacky finding, really, and it has to do with submitting financial statements timely. Financial statements are due from El Dorado County to TRPA 180 days after the end of the fiscal year, unless they ask for an extension, which they did. And they received a 90-day extension, which brought it to just before the end of March of 2023. El Dorado County generally does not submit the financial statements to TRPA. What they do is they post the financial statements on their website and then tell TRPA that the statements are available for them to pull down on their own. It's usually best if they submit them because it's an easier, cleaner cutoff. However, in all the years past, we were able to go get the financial statements off the website to see when they're submitted. It's hard to tell when they're actually submitted because there's no submission date. That we go by the date of the auditor's report. The date of the auditor's report in this case was just a couple days after the end of that 3-month extension, hence a non-compliance issue. But in the big scheme of things, it really, they were submitted. It's not an issue. What can happen if you don't submit financial statements is funding could be withheld related to the TDA audits, but that's just not the case because they were submitted. It was 2 days late, and no other issues on that. There were no other comments on any of the TDA on the Placer County TDA report. Next slide. From a single audit perspective, this is your audit of federal financial expenditures. We looked at 6.6 million in federal expenditures this year, and the federal government outlines a lengthy criteria is how you go through and identify what they call major programs. And it's a process we go through to determine which programs we're going to test in detail. And that could change year over year. This past year, there were 2 programs that had to be tested as major, Fish and Wildlife Coordination Assistance and the Highway Planning and Construction. That amounted to about 3.3 million, or about half of your total federal expenditures for the year. And we had no findings related to the expenditure of federal funds. Next slide. From a TSAC and Prop 1B perspective, there were no adjustments that were proposed and no findings that were that we had. Next slide. This year, there was one new accounting principle that had to be implemented, and that was GASB 96. It should not say fiduciary activities there. That's a misnomer. It's really subscription-based information technology arrangements. That's a mouthful. But what it is if the organization has any IT arrangements where they're subscribing to web-based services or other types of information technology arrangements. In years past, we just expense those on your books. Now, the GASB wants to see those actually capitalized as a right of use asset, much like we did last year with when the lease standard got implemented. So this year, management went through and they had identified 14 different IT arrangements that could be subject to this criteria. All of those, we analyzed all of those. There were actually none that met the criteria, so there's nothing on the books related to this new standard. But we did have to go through, management had to go through the exercise of identifying them and evaluating them. The reason they weren't, those 14 were not included on the statements is either the subscription was less than 12 months, TRPA has the ability to cancel at any time the subscription, or the subscription is for as needed services, and none of those types of things qualify for reporting on your balance sheet. Next slide. In preparing the financial statements, there's a handful of estimates that and judgments that management can use, and there are 3 more significant ones on your financial statements. That has to do with useful lives of the assets, accruals for goods and services, that invoices have not yet been received by the time we conduct the audit, but management estimates what those bills are going to be that are going to be coming in. And then the employees' usage of their accumulated vacation and compensatory leave time. We did evaluate all of those estimates and found them all to be reasonable and had a sound basis for making those estimates. So we had no issues there. Next slide. During the course of the audit, we had no disagreements with management, And at the end of the audit, we do request management to provide us with certain representations. And these representations are things like management confirming to us that they gave us full access to all the people we want to talk to, answered fully to our questions, didn't hold anything back, and they provided that letter to us. To our knowledge, there were no consultations with other accountants during this past year as to the application of accounting principles. And we do remain available as a source to TRPA throughout the year. We conduct the audit during a small period of time, but auditing standards do get implemented or can be implemented year after year. And we do encourage management to reach out if they have any questions throughout the year on how to implement something or just an unusual transaction that may come up, to reach out. It's much better to have that open dialogue throughout the year and discuss issues before we get to the audit and have things not get implemented the way that they probably should be. And so with that, that's the results of the audit. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have regarding the audit process.
Excellent. Well, thank you and congratulations. I've been on both sides of audits and you sweat a lot. Right. Ms. Reagan.
Madam Chair, thank you, Julie Reagan, TRPA's Executive Director. I just wanted to say thank you to our auditors and to our incredible team. And note that Chris Kyler, after many years of service, this will be his last audit as our Finance Director and Chief Financial Officer. And just couldn't be prouder of this team and Chris's work and the incredible work of Kathy and the staff that you were introduced to earlier. You know, we take this really seriously, and over the years that I've been at TRPA, have really watched this team be a powerhouse in the basin to enable environmental funds, particularly from federal and state sources, to be deployed on the ground in a more expeditious manner than most other partners can deliver. And that only comes with excellence. And we're really grateful for that. So I just wanted to acknowledge Chris and thank him for his service. We'll soon have an announcement about a new Chief Financial Officer and Administrative Officer, but today just really wanted to say thank you to Chris and for his leadership and for the incredible team. And then to beg your indulgence, I have to pop into the legal committee
Yes.
meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'll ask committee members that are in the room. Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask at this time? No? Okay. To our committee members that are online, do you have any questions?
No, great job.
Okay, then let's go to public comment on this item. If any member of the public wishes to address the Operations and Governance Committee on this agenda item, please raise your hand now, either in person or by clicking the raise hand button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or by dialing *9 on your phone, and you will be called upon and unmuted by a TRPA staff member. Are there any members in the room that would like to address the committee? Okay, seeing none, are there any members online?
Madam Chair, there are no hands raised online to make public comment.
Okay, thank you. Then we'll go ahead and close public comment and we'll bring it back to the committee for a possible motion.
Before that, I just wanted to ditto Julie's comments. Chris, you've done such an outstanding job for this agency, from being external to the agency for many years and now being here on the board. We can't thank you enough, and the team. Often you're the overlooked group who don't get in front of us much, like I don't think ever, since I've been on the board. So, but what a great job you do, and how important it is to our reputation, to delivering the projects. And I think Julie said outstanding public record, Chris, on your service. So thank you.
Thank you. And on behalf of the team, thanks for your support and your appreciation.
So with that, I'll make a motion
Thank
to
you.
approve.
Thank you. There's a motion. Is there any further discussion? Okay, do we need to do a roll call vote? Thank you.
Mr. Aguilar? Ms. Gustafson?
Yes.
Ms. Dis?
Yes.
Mr. Honigman?
Yes.
Ms. Hill?
Yes.
Ms. Lane?
Yes,
Madam Chair, that motion passes.
excellent. Congratulations. Those are hard. Good for
Thank
you. And, I think also I would hope it makes all of us on this committee, because we deal with the financials every month, really confident that if it's even possible to find a replacement for you, you set up great standards and processes, and whoever comes in should be able to just pick up right there and take off, and hopefully have clean audits going forward.
We'll have a good team. That's what I'm happy about, is I'm leaving my successor with a first-rate team.
Okay, this brings us to agenda item number 4, which can be found on page 81 of your packet. Back to you, Mr. Kyler.
Again, Chris Kyler, Finance Director, for the record. We can have the first chart, please. But before we get into this, I need to bring up one issue that's kind of more of a long-term threat than an immediate threat. This is the budget cycle time, of course, in California. We submitted our initial BCPs back in August, and they're in the middle of preparing the governor's recommended budget that will be released in January. We'd actually had some fair amount of success working with Department of Finance and Natural Resources and some budget issues. But last week they got their initial revenue projections in, and they are very bad.
Yeah.
They have a $68 billion shortfall, for those of you who have not heard that. There were some delays in getting some tax data as well. So it turns out they actually had a shortfall for last year as well. So we're at the very beginning of a long process, but it's going to be a difficult road in California right now. And the preliminary indication we've received is what they're going to do is they're not going to include any BCPs, they call them budget change proposals, in the governor's budget. The governor's budget will only basically include continuing funding for existing programs at continuing levels. And they're in a major effort within California to start identifying areas where they can make some reductions. There is a rainy day fund that they can tap into. They're mostly talking about looking at kind of the one-time only projects that they've approved for the budgets and cutting those down or clawing that money back. But it's a long road to go, and it'll be a while before we really know anything. All the BCPs will be included in what they call the May revise. After they do the initial budget in January, they do a revise in May when they do a final revenue projection. And so everybody in California is going to be sitting, waiting for that final revenue projection to see what comes in there. I think I've mentioned this in here before. California is heavily dependent on income tax revenue, especially a very progressive income tax revenue. And that creates a bit of volatility in their revenue, more so than Nevada, which of course is entirely based on gaming tax and sales tax. And when you look at sales tax is an awful lot of that comes from tourism as well. So Nevada's more tourist. They're in reasonably good shape, but California, because they're so heavily dependent on income tax, has a problem. No immediate action on anybody's part, but it's going to be a challenging budget, and we won't know until fairly late in the process.
And that $100,000 that we've kind of been anticipating for the salary adjustments, is that caught up in any of this, or do you think that's going to go through?
I suspect we're not going to get that. We're debating now as to how hard to push at this time. So we have to make an executive decision as to whether or not it's worth the angst that we would generate by doing that. In theory, they have the money, but obviously Department of Finance is entirely focused on this. And so it's looking unlikely, I think, at this point, but it's not dead yet. Angela and I, as Angela stepped out, are still working the issue, and we're kind of testing the waters to see what we can do.
And
Oh, she is there.
January, oh,
My legacy to Angela, she has to solve this problem.
Yeah. So the governor's budget, I serve on the Sierra Nevada Conservancy Board, and so we were given instruction to call it a revenue deficit, and that they're seeking budget solutions, not cuts. But the state fire marshal serves on a committee with me. I saw him yesterday at a meeting, and he said, yeah, it's about 1/6 of the budget. We do have the rainy day fund, but imagine, cuts across the board. even using the rainy day fund. But 54% of the state's budget goes to school, to education. And so how they make that whole, where they take the rest of the general fund that you'd be competing for. So January 10th will be the governor's release of his budget. So they've known it's coming. They kept delaying those income taxes. So
Yeah, and I don't think, like I said, we won't see, January 10th is going to be kind of a bare bones business as usual budget. So the real action will come in May, and we're going to be on tenterhooks until then. And that creates some issues with Nevada now, because now we're going to have to go talk to Nevada and say, things aren't going so well with the match coming from California. So I have some ugly conversation. Yeah. So it's kind of weird, because for the last 10 years, Nevada's been in financial difficulty, and we have issues on the Nevada side with the 2/3, 1/3 ratio. That got healed in this budget round for the current biennium in Nevada. And now we're having problems on the California side. So we're playing whack-a-mole. Okay, getting back to this year, we're 5 months into the fiscal year. There's no major leans against the budget. I have to admit, when I first looked at the numbers, I'm like, wow, these didn't change much from last month. But when you look at the calendar and some of the things that were going on, we only had one accounts payable cycle during the month. And the last pay period of the month actually was paid in December 1st, so it didn't count against the November financials. So it looks like we're down a little bit, but we're really not. We're still making progress there. For example, we're 42% of the way to the fiscal year, but in terms of numbers of payroll, it's only 38%. And our actual comp expense was 35%. So it's not that big of a drop. We are continuing to look at planning fees. I've been flagging that all along. Starting to lag a little bit. We're still above the historic average, but we're still not quite at the budget level. You did approve some changes in planning fees last month's meeting, and those were not factored into our budget. So the flow through of those planning fee increases for those selected items that were approved as part of Arlo's package, I think will bring us back on target once we implement those and get those into place. Wendy is telling me they're still going strong in planning. They're still getting plenty of application permits, and she's still seeing them as being a lot of leading indicator ones that we talk about, like land capabilities and stuff like that. So we're still optimistic. I think there's reason to be optimistic about it, but it's planning fees is always kind of the guess in our budgeting process. It's the one where we're kind of making up a number and hoping it comes true. Everything else is pretty much known. So that's the only issue there. Next chart, please. Again, we're making the fonts bigger on this so people can actually read it. The state revenue, of course, comes in right away, so we're at almost 100% there. The only lag in there is really the TSAC money that's counted against there. The grants are kind of low, and I've been kind of poking at that a little bit. And I just want to say that there's a couple grants in particular where we've gotten a large amount of money, like the Forest Service scenario where they're giving us $5 million a year that we can then turn around and pass on to EIP partners for items that are on the EIP list. And we'll talk about more of that when we get to the procurement thing. And those really just kind of got kicked off. So we haven't had a chance to go out and distribute the money, and they haven't had a chance to go out and spend it. So there's some pretty big lags on a couple of those big ticket items that we included in the budget. Maybe we don't make that revenue projection during the course of the year, but it's all cost reimbursed stuff. It's all contracted out to other people or passed on to other partner entities. So the revenues and the expenses would both change by the same amount, and it wouldn't have any real impact to the bottom line. And that's mostly that 5 million in LTRA 5. Next chart, please. The expense side, I kind of talked about a little bit in terms of the comp. It's 35% versus 38% in terms of payroll, so that's fine. I mean, we have some vacancies, and we really just did the salary reviews a little bit late. We did that in late September, early October, so they'll start kicking in. Contracts are lagging quite a bit. That's normal for us. It's always been a frustration. And a big part of that is the funding on those grants I was telling you about that just haven't kicked off yet and haven't kicked in the high gear on that yet. We did make a debt service payment December 1st. It's not shown on here yet because this is through November 30th, but that will show up. So that's 160K in interest and 235,000 in principal. And that's normal. Next chart, please. And then here's the cash flow with and without the mitigation funds. And as you can see, we have turned the corner, and it's all downhill from here through the rest of the year. We get that big lump up front when the states give us their contribution at the beginning of the year. And then we spent it down over the course of the year. And this kind of shows the trends on that. So perfectly normal, negative cash flow going forward from this point forward, but we've got the money in the bank, so it's not an issue. And that's all I have for the monthly financials, unless you have any questions for me.
Excellent. Questions of the committee members in the room? No? Okay. Any committee members online that have questions? I don't see any hands going up. So we'll go ahead and open up the public. Any members in the room wish to address the committee on the November financials? Seeing nobody running to the podium, are there any members of the public online that would like to address the committee?
Madam Chair, there's no one online to address the committee.
Okay, then we'll go ahead and close public comment and I'll bring it back to the committee for action. There's a recommended motion on page, I believe it's 81.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Okay, I'll make the recommended motion.
Thank you. So the motion is to accept the
Sorry, I
November
didn't have it open.
2023 financials. Is there any further discussion? Okay, may we have a roll call vote, please?
Ms. Gustafson?
Yes.
Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Honigman?
Yes.
Ms. Dis?
Yes.
Ms. Hill?
Yes.
Ms. Lane?
Yes.
Madam Chair, that motion passes.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll go ahead and push forward to item number 6, which is to recommend approval of an update of the procurement policy. This can be found on page 627 of our packet. Mr. Kyler.
And again, Chris Schuyler, Finance Director for the agency. We talked about this back in October. We got some feedback from you and we've incorporated some of that feedback and we still have some proposals to go through with you. The way we set this up is for the board or for the committee to act on it today or not act on it as you see fit. And then we'll take it to the full board in January. Just as a reminder, included in here is there's a structural change to remove all the day-to-day, which forms do you fill out, who has to go through the approval process and all that, and put that in kind of a user manual that doesn't come to you, because otherwise we'd have to bring it back to you like every month to change it because somebody changed jobs or something like that. But that the policy level in terms of how we're to do this would come here to this board. And so what we're proposing in this thing is the policy document. So we took a 65-page procurement manual and turned it into about an 8-page policy. I'm not going to talk any more about that, just to put that in there. We're also talking about updating the levels at which we do a full-blown RFP versus a micro purchase and then kind of in between kind of RFPs, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And there's some specific areas where we found that it's better to contract through negotiation rather than doing a formal RFP. And we're talking about changing that list a little bit. And I'm going to have Katz come up and talk a little bit about some of those changes and why they make sense in just a minute. And then the final thing on here is just that it continues most of the current rules and projections. I'm just presenting you with a delta, the differences between the old and the new. So if I could have the next chart, please. On the procurement levels, this hasn't really changed much from the last time we talked in October. And my main point on this is these low level stuff, we're rolling out a new credit card program. And these are mostly the kind of expenses that we're just going to pay on a credit card. So it's kind of silly to think of an RFP process or something like that when all you're doing is going down to the lumberyard and buying some stuff and things like that. So I think boosting that from 5,000 to 10,000 is a good idea. The formal RFPs didn't want to create some compactness in there in between. So from 10,000 to 50,000, we do an informal RFP where you call around, get quotes from at least 3 vendors, if not more, and then make a decision. And then we'll do the full blown RFPs for anything over $50,000. I didn't really feel like the committee gave me much feedback last month on that. So I just left this in there. If you have questions or concerns about that, by all means, bring it up. This does reflect, well, this is actually much lower than the federal rules, but to the federal rules, I mean, $800,000 is a small procurement for them. That's a pretty big procurement for us. We only have a couple of contracts that exceed $800,000. So, okay. With that, I'd like to move on to the next chart. Um, we're going to talk more about some of these. Let me just talk about the first one briefly, because this is just kind of cleaning up, because we had this situation a couple times where people question, well, why didn't you do an RFP? And the answer is, well, when we applied for the grant, we applied as a team. And so naturally, then when we got the grant, we assumed we were going to go forward as the team. But I think that makes perfect sense, but it wasn't actually explicit in the rules. So I want to put that in the rules so that we don't get challenged on that going forward. The next two items will go into more detail, and that is third-party funding, where we're working with a third party to determine how those funds get allocated. And then the third one there is the long-term partnerships. And then the fourth one on here, I won't talk about in more detail, but this is I actually jammed like three of them together. It's one that's always been there in terms of where you can only get things from one person. And the only real change on there is to acknowledge that software is increasingly that same thing. For example, our Excel program that we use for permitting, that's a hosted software by Excel Corporation. It's proprietary software, and they only allow certain licensed consultants to touch their software. So if we want to do anything to modify Excel to meet our needs, we have to go to a licensed software specialist, and there's only a handful of them. With that, let's go to the next chart. So this is, I'm trying to make the description and the policy as generic as possible, but this is really the LTRA, $5 million a year that we're getting. We're kind of getting it from the Forest Service. I'm sorry. Let's skip this chart. This is the one I said I was going to skip over. This is the one that is really about LTRA. So it does come up periodically when we get funding for a specific purpose, and the Forest Service money is an example of that. And I'm going to let Kat talk to the next chart because she's the expert on the Forest Service contract.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I'll dig in a little bit on this Forest Service TRPA contract that we have in place. So this was for the Lake Tahoe Restoration Act fiscal year 22 funding. Forest Service and TRPA entered into the agreement to pass the LTRA funding from the Forest Service to the TRPA, and there were several reasons we did this. One, the Forest Service has budgetary constraints requiring funding to be expended within the fiscal year, essentially a use it or lose it policy. So if they do not get that funding out into contracts to partners, it goes back to the federal treasury and it is no longer available for funding. And then TRPA has the capacity and had the capacity in terms of contract and project management to work with our non-federal partners to set up those contracts and then manage those contracts and those projects going forward. The Forest Service and TRPA collaboratively determined that which non-federal projects would be awarded funding for watersheds and water quality and forest health using the LTRA Environmental Improvement Program priority project list. So this is an annual list and process that is done where the EIP working groups get together, they collaborate with each other, all of the implementers determine which projects are going to be the highest ranked for LTRA funding. That gets spun up, it's presented to the Tahoe Interagency Executive Steering Committee, and then that goes on to Congress as a lump sum. So they don't see the projects, but they see the bottom line for each category. So for forest health, you wouldn't see the projects, you'd see the total. So we use those lists to identify which non-federal implementers collaboratively, and then that way we did not end up going through our standard procurement policies, which would have included RFPing out for those projects to apply to get that funding because they had already been vetted.
Yeah, and the point I'd like to make is we don't do a subsequent call for projects because we already have the project list. We developed the project list long before we have the funding, so it's irrelevant. Sorry, any questions on that one? Let's go to the next one then. This is the one that we had some conversation last time. So this is the one where we're talking about a strategic partnership with another government entity and not going through an RFP process for work under that kind of strategic partnership. In response to some of the feedback we got last month, we proposed this kind of a relationship that these type of strategic partnerships would come here, that you as the governing borders or ops committee would approve those relationships. that we will review these relationships with you at least every 5 years, which is the standard for the RFPs as well. And that obviously staff is going to be managing and reviewing these continuously during the course of the operation of the agreement. At any point in time, this doesn't preclude us from going to RFP if we think there's an opportunity there, or if we're dissatisfied with performance and we want to look at our options and things like that. And so there's a couple of scenarios that kind of lay out why we think this is the practical way to go. And again, I'll stick Kat with responding to that. Maybe Dennis can help. her.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and Dennis Baglow is here. He's the program manager for the Aquatic Invasive Species Program, so he can help field any specific questions on these contracts. Next slide. There we go. So a good example of what Chris was just talking about is the Tahoe RCD prevention program and contracting. So TRCD has been a trusted partner for this contract and for the watershed inspection program and the prevention program since 2008 and essentially its inception. Us partnering and being able to do a contract with them offers efficiencies in terms of staff capacity that do not exist at TRPA. So when I say something like that, I mean, they are able to hire and work with 20 to 30 different employees during a seasonal time period and manage all of those moving pieces where we are not able to do that. The Tahoe RCD is a government entity whose mission is to protect the Lake Tahoe Basin and was formed in 1974. So I see the date changing. So there is an assurance there when you partner with another government entity that they have a similar mission and drive to do the work to the best of their ability, to meet environmental compliance in a way that TRPA also has the similar goal and mission. TRCD has proven technical and institutional expertise. They are considered a resource to all AIS programs throughout the West. So very similar to TRPA, they're kind of part of that gold standard when we talk about AIS nationally. They help develop all the protocols and equipment that are really the model for prevention, again, across the West. This was brought up at the last board or the last ops committee, I believe, about what about a private enterprise handling the prevention program or the inspection program. And other states have tried that. And what they found was it was actually more expensive to have a contractor than to use an agency or public employees, and that they actually struggled to ensure the dedication to the goals and purpose of the AIS program. TRPA staff does review the program budget annually with TRCD and identifies opportunities for direct cost savings and how do we retain those qualified staff. And as Chris mentioned, an RFP can always be utilized in the future if necessary. Next slide. Another good example of this, and again, Dennis, if you have additions, please feel free to hop in, is the Spooner Mobility Hub and Permanent AIS Inspection Station. This is a project where TRPA and TTD are partnering together because we have a shared goal in providing services to the public at that project site and a shared need for consultation and consultant services. So TTD has that project management experience of consultants, especially in terms of design and development of facilities. And it is significantly more efficient as a partner to work with them rather than pursue two separate contracts for consultants on the same project on the same site, where those consultants and contracts need to be kind of communicating all the time to ensure that we have an overall vision for that project. So TRPA and TTD are working together on selection of those contract services. We are involved in the RFP development and all RFP and bid reviews. And TRPA staff are ensuring needs and timelines and budgets are being met in terms of the AIS element of that larger project. Next slide.
And if you have specific questions on that, I see Nick's like slipped into the room in the back too, but that's a multi-party arrangement there where you have NDOT working on it. It's all part of the Highway 28 corridor. There's a whole bunch of stuff going on. And we think it's smart not to have too many cooks in the kitchen on this one and clearly lay out some responsibilities. With that, I'll put it back to the committee. The question is, are you comfortable with these changes? Would you like to give us more feedback to have us go back and reconsider some of this stuff? Or are you okay with us bringing this back in January for the full board approval on consent calendar?
Questions, Ms. Gustafson?
Thank you. I don't have any questions. I'm comfortable with the recommendations.
You're a man of few words this morning.
I'm
Say-
saving it.
I'm saving it, I hope.
Ms. Dis or Ms. Hill online, do you, either of you have any comments?
No, I
Reg-
think this is a great approach. Thank you.
You're saying.
Yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say I agree with Ms. Hill. I think it's a great approach. I did have one question on more on the informal RFP process where we call around and get bids or quotes, excuse me, rather than the higher dollar contracts. Do we have any, does the policy include, and I apologize if it does and I missed it, but any recommendations or requirements on like how far afield we have to go? Especially when we're in a situation where there maybe is only one person in the region that offers the service. Does it say like, oh, you have to go look down the hill on either side of the lake, or do we have a process for handling situations like that? Other than what you explained, Chris, about the software and where there's really only one person who is legally allowed to do the job, maybe. I mean more about like smaller goods and services that just maybe aren't available in the region. What's the process for that?
No, that's an excellent question, and the situation has come up. Sorry, Chris Tyler, Finance Director, both in that category and even in the formal RFP. Just as an example, we had a lot of boat repair work done last year, and there aren't that many people around that work on boats, particularly our type of boats. And we had to go to Sacramento and Reno and everywhere. I think one thing we had to do, we actually got out of Southern California. So we do have to reach out across that. It is a constrained contractor community up here, so it varies by type of contract. But yeah, we do reach out as far as we can, but we've been in that situation where there's really only one or two contractors that do business up here. And it would be a stretch to hire somebody who's, 200 miles away and have them come all the way up here and do stuff. We run into that problem, I believe, on AIS too with divers. Tahoe has some very specific safety rules for professional divers because of the altitude. And it's hard to find somebody who can meet those requirements, meet the certifications necessary to do high altitude diving.
If I can add, Dennis Abagalo, Aquatic Invasive Species Program Manager. Just in general, just having those partnerships and networks allow us to reach out to our partners and ask them these types of questions. For example, with the boats, working with the law enforcement, what do they do with their boats? Who do you guys use? And so having those built-in networks really helps that aspect of finding those people when there is a really limited pool up here.
So the answer, Alexis, is yes, we do go out of basin and look for people, but it's usually winds up being impractical. And that's when we have to bite the bullet and go with who we can get.
And what would your thoughts be on how long of a period of time do you think it would take to test this new procurement policy and see if it's creating the efficiencies that you were looking for, and maybe report back to at least this group on, is it working? Does it need some more tweaks?
It would probably occur sometime after I leave. So I can commit to anything on that for you if you'd like. I think within a year or so, we should be able to show.
Okay.
To show that it's fine.
So I'm
I mean,
thinking,
it's not-
yeah, maybe if you could come back in December around the time we do everything and just see if this is working. I think it sounds really good. I just want to make sure that there's enough controls around it that it works,
Yeah, definitely.
not inadvertently abused.
You get, maybe we can, comes up a lot in the budget cycle, because during the budget cycle, we ask you to approve the contract list. So it may be a little premature to do it in 3 months when we're starting to bring the next year's budget to you, but the following year, as we go through that budget list, we can talk about it. That might be a good point of context to address it.
Okay, perfect.
I think what we're asking you to do today then is to vote to recommend to the board that they adopt the new policy. So, and then
Yep.
we'll bring it to the full board in January.
In January, okay, I saw that. But let's go ahead and open this up to members of the public. And then we'll bring it back for action. So we'll go to public comment on this item. If any member of the public wishes to address the Operations and Governance Committee on this item, please raise your hand now, either in person or by clicking the raise hand button. Are there anybody in the room that would like to address the committee on the new procurement policy? Seeing none, we'll go online.
Madam Chair, there are no hands raised to make public comment.
Okay, thank you. We'll go ahead and close the public comment and bring it back to the committee for action as you see fit.
Okay, I'll move that we recommend adoption of the new TRPA procurement policy to the board.
Thank you, Ms. Gustafson. Is there any further discussion? We'll ask for a roll call vote.
Mr. Aguilar? Ms. Gustafson?
Yes.
Ms. Dis?
Yes.
Mr. Honigman?
Yes.
Ms. Hill?
Yes.
Ms. Lane?
Yes.
Madam Chair, the motion passes.
Okay, we're on item number 7, upcoming topics. Is there anything we need to be aware of?
If I could have the slide, please. Chris Kyler, Finance Director. Main thing is a reminder that our investment advisor from the principal group, Bruce Remington, will be here in January to do their annual update in terms of markets and where they see markets go. Those investments, of course, are bouncing all over the place these days, so feel free to beat them up over that. And then we'll finalize the procurement policy
In January, got it.
in January.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
Then the next cycle will be working on budget, and probably in the May timeframe, we'll be bringing you some budget issues to resolve.
Thank you. Are there any committee members that have questions or comments? And I don't see any raised hands online. So thank you. We'll conclude that item as that was informational only. We'll now go to item number 8. This is an opportunity for committee members to make any comments on anything they desire. Are there any comments from committee members? Okay, then we'll go to public interest comments. Our final matter of business is our general public interest comment period. If any member of the public wishes to address the Ops and Governance Committee at this time, please raise your hand now, either in person or by clicking the raise hand button. Are there any public in the room that would like to address the Ops and Governance Committee? Seeing none, we'll go online.
Madam Chair, there are no hands raised for public comment.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to adjournment. Is there a motion to adjourn? Thank you, Ms. Gustafson.
Yes. You're so.
Yeah. There's a motion to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
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 Thank you. We'll stand adjourned.